I'm going to share with you some deliberately simple thoughts to close our day about leadership and some of the transition issues to do with leadership that many of our colleagues and those we work with are facing at the moment. And I don't need to list for you the ways in which we are going through testing times at the moment. Don't need to list for you the ways in which the future is uncertain. Suffice to say that there are many of them, and there are many likely transitions. I think it's quite interesting that that word transition has come up a number of times throughout the course of the day, and you probably have already yourself identified some key aspects in which that's going to be a challenge, possibly for yourself, the people you support, the people whose NHS you care about. And so I think I'd encourage you to bear these various challenges and threats and opportunities in mind as we think about some of the leadership issues it raises for us. Because I think at present, because of the pause, we're in a situation where the number of unknowns possibly outweighs the number of knowns about where we'll be in a year's time. And yet, there are people right now doing the day job of delivering care for their patients, and there are people doing what for many is the new day job of designing care, new services, evaluating existing ones for their populations. And so the biggest question in my mind, to begin with, is how do you handle that degree of uncertainty? And what matters most? And it's quite funny that Chris likened my task to that of Moses. I'm going to tell you another story about someone who built their house on sand, and the rain came down, and the waters rose, and the wind beat against the house, and frankly the inevitable happened, in spite of the fact that it's quite a nice looking house on the left. Build your house on solid foundations and life goes better for you. And I think the things which are coming to us, and some of the being in an uncertain place, actually for many organisations does represent a significant storm experience. And I think what's interesting is that storms and times of uncertainty are a time that test our foundations. They're also a time that expose our foundations. And I would hope actually that we would welcome both of those, particularly perhaps at the moment the exposing of the foundations on which consortia are building their new work, or building on a continuum of work for those who've been doing great stuff for a long time. Because I actually think also pauses are a good opportunity to build and tend to the foundations. And so one of the things that the Centre for Commissioning is encouraging people to do at this particular time is to ask questions about what the foundations are on which new work is being built. I'd like to explore some of that. Here is a commissioning cycle. It's the Information Centre's commissioning cycle. There are many examples of it. One of the interesting things I hear when speaking to people working in Pathfinders at the moment, and people providing development, training and support to Pathfinders, is a great sense of urgency about the need to rush down to these middle and perhaps even later stages of the commissioning activity. The number of places who say, what we really need to do round here is deal with this thing about out-of-hours contraception. Or what we really need to grapple with is total hip replacements. Or we've just been shown the budget book, and oh my giddy aunt, we're terrified by that, and we've just got to save money somehow. And one of the reasons I think it is helpful to look at a cycle is that while ongoing, cycles do have a starting point for a good reason, and strategic planning comes first in the process for good reason. But especially at a time when we're trying to do things or being encouraged to do things differently from how we've done it before, there's something that comes even before the start of the cycle, which I think you can describe, if you wish, as a gateway to quality commissioning, which is all about the people you have on board and the relationships and the commitments you have with those people. Because, frankly, it doesn't really matter in many areas how well you do procurement if you've not built that idea of what we've just been hearing, the integrated care pathway, crossing sectors, highly complex, built over time. If you've not got the relationships right to make that happen, then the greatest contracts managers in the world are not going to deliver the greatest outcomes for your population. And the big encouragement, I think, for us at the moment is, while in transition, while in a pause, and certainly while most of this isn't fully happening for real yet, we're still talking about shadow organisations in most places, this is the time to be asking, who have you got on board? Who have you got through the gateway now who are coming with you on this lovely journey around the commissioning cycle? Because if those aren't the right people, you're in trouble. If those aren't the right people with whom you have the right kind of relationships, you're in trouble. And some of that is for very self-interested reasons. So the consortia who take tough decisions about decommissioning, who don't have the right relationships with the right portions of the community and the population and their patient groups and the media, are going to find life very stormy indeed. But mostly it's for non-selfish reasons, which is we know that the best care is designed by the full multi-professional team who deliver that care. We know that even better than that, the best care is designed by professionals and patients and their carers collaborating. And that actually some of the really most exciting examples of new approaches to deliver great care without costs going up every year actually involve a much greater degree of patients, carers and the community meeting their own needs. So the idea that this is a bureaucratic specialist enterprise which should be undertaken only by people with the appropriate training and insurance and a hard hat probably has to be dispensed with quite ruthlessly, in favour of talking first about who's on the journey with you, what your foundations are like. Because there is a lot to be done in terms of getting the right governance, the right structures, the right processes in place for the new NHS. An awful lot of the concerns raised by Parliament, political parties, think tanks, professional groups, commentators about the NHS reforms hinge around these questions of how do you do governance well? What's the best kind of structure to achieve the kind of accountability we'd like to see? How do you ensure that the processes of decision making are sufficiently robust to handle £80 billion worth of the public's money appropriately and safely and right? And rightly so. These are desperately important issues, and getting them right, perhaps testing them right rather than just planning our way out of a crisis, it matters enormously. But they are not foundational issues, I would argue. The foundational issues are these two at the bottom of values and relationships. And just like good foundations protect you from storms, they also enable you to build something better. So I think it's worth talking a little bit more about what our vision is for the values and the relationships and how they ought to be built, and how now is a particularly good time to be building them, partly because now is the start and you've got to get things right before moving on. I'm a big fan of the principle of get it right first time, but also because actually a pause, while unsettling in many ways, is a great opportunity to tend to things before the storm rages again. Let's think first about what the values for really great commissioning should look like, and then actually why values matter. And I'll give some thoughts about that, but I think it might be an interesting one to talk about in discussion. We think that four broad themes are important when considering the values which should underpin a great, effective and resilient consortium. That it should be community focused, it should be collaborative, clinically led and comprehensive. I'm not going to go into detail and read all those details for you. You can digest them at will. But the themes here are about not just doing things right and doing the right things, but knowing why they are right so that you can stick to those guns. These are things that set principles on which you ought to expect processes and strategies and structures should be built. I think one of the interesting things is that, by and large, we're not building completely new organisations here. There's a lot of heritage. And that's great in many respects in allowing continuity, organisational memory, effective relationships to continue. But there's some problems when it's harder to spot misalignment between our existing structures, our existing ways of doing things, and the new values we'd like to re-emphasise or reiterate. And so we think it is worth re-emphasising these values of a collaborative, community-focused, clinical and comprehensive approach to the design and the delivery of services. And the importance, if that is a foundational issue, of being quite honest, quite ruthless, perhaps getting some external assistance in checking the degree to which everything else does align with those values. Because while there's an extent to which this is a bit of motherhood and apple pie, if you actually look at the ways in which we go about commissioning in many areas, those values aren't so well represented in the way we tend to do things, or the structures, or the relationships we have to achieve that kind of vision. So I think this could be a useful starting point, as well as a checklist for those who are clearly not at the start, they're some way down a journey, to ask whether the values are right. There are many reasons why it's helpful getting the values right. One is to make sure that you do the right things. The other is to make sure you do things right. And the other is actually lies in the opportunity it presents to do with relationships. So let's think a bit about the relationships and the ways in which having the right values reflected throughout our activity in commissioning can help with those relationships. Lots and lots of people need to be involved in relationship with one another and with a high-performing commissioning organisation. Some of these relationships can be built and have already been built in quite a bureaucratic kind of way. But there are one set of relationships which are actually quite difficult to build in a bureaucratic way, and that's the clinical relationships between the people who deliver the services we're designing. And you can get so far by creating committees or expectations or requirements or information channels which hope to try and connect people. But by and large, clinicians prefer to do business relationally. By and large, clinicians are influenced relationally first. By and large, clinicians perceive themselves as deriving their satisfaction, their sense of purpose, and certainly their desire to change on the basis of relationship, on the basis of value, and connecting those two. And so one of the reasons why getting good values right and aligning everything with them is actually a functional one, that it makes it easier to get people on board. It makes it easier when you're making the sometimes difficult, sometimes controversial, sometimes hard work decisions about commissioning, to get the degree of buy-in, the degree of commitment, the degree of discretionary effort, which we know is vital for clinicians to be as on board as we need them to be. Having people grudgingly following a plan is never a great place to be. And if you reach the stage of people grudgingly following your plan, you've probably not got the values and the relationships right in the first place. And I think that's part of what we've seen in many people's experience with QIP. That QIP started out as a very well-reasoned, very well-evidenced, very well-organised bureaucratic need of the NHS to change the way things are done. But it's still quite hard to find many GPs who aren't intimately involved in a commissioning organisation to tell you what QIP's about. yet more to ask them how it influences the way they do their daily work. And when you start to describe quip, many GPs look horrified, some are actually quite offended, quite cross. And you can see why when you hear them talk about what they value, when you read the evidence about how clinicians and clinical professionals think of themselves and are motivated by their work. It's much more values-based. It's much more relationship-based. They learn about things in a much more relational, experiential, tacit way. And that's also how they get change messages. That's also how they agree with change messages. First, heart and values. Later, rationality. Next, okay, so what does that look like for me? And if we don't take this opportunity now to build consortia in a way that is perceived and received as being more like a relationship, more like a network of peers and colleagues than a bureaucratic organisation, then we're probably going to miss a great opportunity when we start talking about the tough stuff to get people on board with us. There's a lot of talk going on at the moment in the listening exercise about getting people on the board. Who should be on the board? And I heard someone yesterday say, I'm a physiotherapist, and what AHPs want is a place on the board. And I heard someone this morning say, I work in mental health, and what mental health practitioners want is a place on the board. We want to be governing and holding to account. And I think there's a problem about getting 100, 150, 250 people around a board table to do that kind of stuff. And perhaps what we're talking about is informing and influencing, and the need to have relationships that bring people in to do that function, more than to be decision-making, governing, to being held to account. It's one small thought that's very topical about relationships and what their purpose is. And the next really is just, as I've been describing, we have an opportunity to choose, really, the extent to which consortia build a tight-knit organisation around themselves with clearly defined parameters and a hierarchy, leading positionally the people who are now under them in some kind of hierarchy. Or the choice to be a bit more risky, a bit more relational, organic, hard to grapple with, but perhaps more evidence-based, actually, to really make this lovely phrase of distributed leadership real. Distributed leadership has been a phrase in all these leadership frameworks in the NHS for a long time, and it's hard to see that many situations where it's actually being made a reality. And one opportunity is deliberately to be less bureaucratic and more relational in the way you connect people, in the way you gain their input. I heard someone talking the other day about the opportunity to use nerve endings and networks that connect people and switch relationships on and off as necessary, rather than asking everyone to come into the club and have either an enormous club or a very elitist club. These networks of relationships are probably more resilient to what could be fundamental changes to some of the structural questions. What's the function of a consortium? What are the requirements on a consortium to have a board of one shape or another? Well, people have begun interpreting what was in the bill, but we don't know if there's going to be a bill in 2 or 3 months' time. Yeah, all bets could be off. And I certainly think all things are up for grabs. And so the more we build on things that are sustainable, that definitely won't change, the more resilient we're likely to be. And the better able we are to connect with hearts and minds continually as we move on. If you're interested in that, I'd really recommend some of the work of Marshall Gans to you. And if you look on a bookshop, look up Marshall Gans and read particularly, I think, the lovely book describing his work in the presidential campaign for Barack Obama, and the ways in which they deliberately chose to be less like a bureaucratic organisation and more like a social movement in order to connect the commitment of many, many, many people. Because how you lead is determined largely by what you put first, the governance and structures or the values and the relationships. And there's a growing body of feeling and some evidence that leading relationally and through values first, and on top of that, building governance structures which serve that, not the other way around, is more effective at connecting the large numbers of people that we need to connect with as a consortium. Particularly as quite a lot of the people who will determine how successful a consortium is don't work for the consortium. And there's this thinking about what ties do you have. We've been talking about relationships between people, what ties you use between the people that you're seeking to influence. And there's a description of weak ties and strong ties. And strong ties are hierarchical, contractual, you work for me, this is what you're going to do it, I'll measure it and I'll see you next week. And weak ties are, you don't work for me, but we work together for common good. Are you prepared to commit to come with me on this journey, commit to do one thing, and we'll talk about how you feel it's going next week? It's quite a risky approach, but it might be the saviour of an organisation. It doesn't know what its structure is going to be in a year's time, but has to get on now with getting people on board, has to get on now with getting people to change their behaviour. And it's still quite easy for GPs, and I am one, to stare back at the NHS and say, make me. It's jolly difficult to do, and you can create the structures and you can write the lengthy, detailed operating procedures that might make me, but it'll take you a while. And what happens when the goalposts move a bit next month or next year? So having values and relationships is the foundation, the starting block, the thing you value above all else, makes it easier to lead through commitment. I don't believe it makes it easy. I don't think achieving this is ever easy, but I think it makes it easier. And it offers perhaps a new way to build foundations which will be more resilient through storms, and ultimately perhaps more effective at joining up from the patient and the community through the consulting room to the hospital and the community care and back again. Because if we don't make that connection pretty seamless, we're going to fail to achieve some of the opportunities which are before us. So we're encouraging people now to be asking, to be auditing, challenging what their values are, what the relationships they have are, and who's in there with it. And the last small point, if you yourself are someone involved in doing this, we're encouraging you just to guard your heart and make sure you have people around you who got your back. I think there are already some people who are feeling pretty strung out, quite exposed, quite anxious, beginning to show some signs of burnout already. I spoke to someone last week who's a GP in a consortium who's really struggling. And I think, sustainable leadership, particularly through times of uncertainty, challenge and transition, requires to some extent the leaders being protected, having the right people around them. If you know someone who's a consortium leader, make sure that someone's guarding them, because this is an exciting time, but it's perhaps also one of the riskiest times any of us have known in the NHS. So, thank you.